to no vision audience members. I'm a white and East Asian person with shoulder-length brown hair, a blue shirt, and brown pants. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. The restrooms are located around the deli case in the cafe. And History Café is presented in partnership on the third Wednesday of every month with our lovely partners at HistoryLink. Hey, Jennifer. A brief schedule of events. We're gonna start with a great interview / buddy talk. We're so excited. Followed by a Q&A with note cards. And my lovely colleague Rachel in the back has note cards, so if you're so inclined to ask a question, please do ask her for a note card. Tonight, we'll learn about trans and gender diverse activism in Washington. And as we begin to ground in the space, it's really important to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, with impacts that last into today. Today, we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about the people whose land you're on. Tonight's speakers are Danni Askini and Elayne Wylie, the co-founders of Gender Justice League, the organization behind Trans Pride Seattle, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary in 2 days. So we are supremely grateful to have them both here today. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you. Now the microphone is on.
It is.
Do you want to start off and introduce yourself?
I don't.
Okay. My name is Elayne Wylie. I was born here in North Seattle, and I'm a trans woman. I came out on national television. Raise your hand if you are familiar with the Sally Jesse Raphael show. So in the 90s, Phil Donahue, early Oprah, Sally, they would have these little talk shows, and it was an interesting era when they were just like, let's put something on TV. Who knows what's going to happen? A lot of trans people came out. That was the era that people would come out, and I wanted to come out in a very irrevocable way, and so I did that. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. I moved home, and took me a couple more years. I transitioned around 2006, and then I just started serving my community. I started figuring out what was out here and how I could help and how I could serve it. And shortly after that, that's when I met Danni.
Yeah, I remember. Hey everyone, my name is Danni Askini. I use she and her pronouns. I am, just to give a visual description for folks who might be visually impaired, I'm a 5'5", white and native trans woman with red hair and wearing a cream Gucci knockoff dress that I made. Don't hate, but there were trans young people who went on puberty blockers and like, we're all okay. Turns out we grew up to be adults. We're real people. Yeah, I moved to Seattle to start a trans health clinic at Verbena, which was a queer women's health organization that was partnered with Gay City. We used to have a clinic together, Gay City on one side, Verbena on the other, and I was kind of like literally in the middle. So like two trans people, Gay City had a trans person, Verbena had a trans person. We were in the middle. It was very fun. Yeah. And that's actually where I met Elayne when I was like a baby. I mean, it feels like I was a baby.
Yeah. A visual description. I am 5'8", white, very, very pale skin. I burn easily. I have very long graying hair, and I'm wearing all black. And my top is actually one of our Trans Pride Seattle logos in pink. So what was interesting was from 1977 until about 2007, Ingersoll Gender Center, who was founded by Marsha Botzer, and served a trans population that was practically invisible. But people would come from all around the nation, sometimes even the world, just to experience a community of trans people here in Washington State. Mm-hmm. And we met as I was leading some of their programming, and we had an opportunity to sort of partner together, and we've been friends ever since.
Yeah, and I don't think people know that Ingersoll is like the oldest continuous running trans organization, at least that I know of in the world.
Yeah.
And it has historically been it was a support group for a very long time, but it has been going since the 70s here in Seattle.
Yeah.
And it's not like the thing that I think of. I don't think of Seattle as like a historically, like continuously trans community, but it's true.
Yeah. every week since 1977. One really interesting thing was we passed Seattle Public Library main branch on the way to get here downtown. And I remember being a kid and going to the card catalogs, massive cabinets with little drawers, and searching for trans stuff. There was nothing. Now, what I didn't know is you had to look for an abnormal psychology book and look under like T for trans in that book. And if you open that book, you would actually find a brochure. Marsha would actually come into the library and spike those books with information. There was so little information about what it meant to be trans that I didn't even really come out until about a year before I went on TV.
Elayne, I'm going to ask you some questions, and then I want you to ask me some questions.
Excellent.
Okay, so first question. Take me back to 2011, 2012.
Sure.
I'd come back from Sweden. What was happening in Seattle in 2012 in like queer and trans worlds? What was going on?
Show of hands, everything but marriage. Ref 74, 2011, 2012, anyone remember? So in Washington State, before we had federal marriage equality, states were passing those things, Massachusetts, Vermont, things in the Northeast, and Washington had an everything but marriage that allowed people to have civil partnerships, legal partnerships. And there was a mounting campaign, and people who'd been working on this for 10, 15, 20 years were coming together, including a lot of trans people. And what we were seeing was a tremendous amount of effort, an almost certain success, which was true in November of 2012. That's exactly what happened. And a lot of, I'm not going to call it lip service, but a lot of, hey, we're focusing on something doable right now, marriage equality. And then when that's done, we're going to move on the other things, all of the other things. And we felt promised. And we also saw a lot of these organizations saying, oh, that was awesome. All right, back to life, back to our reality and forget the here and now. And we were frustrated. I think we were like, where is everybody? Where's the help that we were promised? And we had been serving our trans community pretty faithfully for a few years. And then nothing. There was like that sense of like, well, maybe we'll get to something in the future. And nobody really knew, and nobody was taking the lead on those things. So we said, I think it was just a group of us that had all been doing individual labor in the community, public speaking, consulting, training, sometimes lobbying. And in our own right, we were all a group of caped crusaders and superheroes. But we had no collective that came together. That was my perspective. What do you think?
Think about your question.
What's that?
Think about your question. Like, I'm a genie. Ask me some questions.
I wish for.
Okay. I can do that.
You came back from Sweden and you saw Ingersoll and you saw marriage equality and. What was the gap that you saw? Could you describe that gap that you saw in the community?
Yeah. So I think my perspective starts in like 1998 in southern Maine, where we were trying to pass a statewide non-discrimination law. I was a sophomore in high school. I'd been out as trans for a while to my family and transitioned, but I came out at school, experienced several hate crimes, and then watched our ballot measure for non-discrimination fail. And then it failed again in 2000, and then it barely passed in 2005. And I remember coming back from Sweden and having this palpable sense that where we are in 2023, that I thought we would get here sooner. I don't know if you remember in 2011, 2012, I was like, okay, marriage equality is gonna wrap up by 2015. I Cassandra that you could see it and like, okay, we're gonna get there. And I saw from Kalamazoo, Michigan, the non-discrimination campaign there had shifted to men in bathrooms and men in women's showers. And I remember Tristan Reese from the National LGBTQ Task Force watching Tristan and other friends, Sarah Reese from the task force as well, talking to them, texting them, doing phone banking for them remotely, and realizing that this was a test bed for what was coming after marriage equality, which was like, how do we scare people into thinking trans people are a threat? And I remember being on the Ref 74 campaign in communications and being pushed out of the campaign. I don't know if you remember that. It was spring of 2012, I think.
Yeah.
And Andy Mara was there, and I think Tristan had come back from Kalamazoo, and all of us got basically shoved out. Like Andy was who's now the head of Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund in New York. We'd gotten pushed out. They were like in organizing, and they got pushed out, and then I got pushed out of communications. It was like, hide the trans people. And I was like, wow, this is like gonna be bad. Yeah. If like what's happening is trans people can't be even in queer organizations because people are ashamed of us. Yeah. And then like, I remember we talked and we were like, we should start our own organization to prepare for bathroom bills and like the current attacks.
Danni's specialty, I will tell you, is like she's a policy maven and is very comfortable in the halls of the legislature of the state. I focused more on workplace equality. In 2008 to 2010, I worked for a local hospital complex, and I was a very, very tiny, tiny little cog in a very, very large machine, and I was being ignored. There were no opportunities that I had, despite my trying, to work on anything related to a non-discrimination policy. And they had, a lot of them at this time, in that era, had LGBTQ policies in name only, and they were very gay, lesbian, and bisexual focused. But if you're familiar with HRC's Corporate Equality Index, the CEI, Human Rights Campaign. If you're familiar, it's a blue square with a yellow equal sign, and that's the logo, if you're familiar with that. And they created an online document that had the sampled companies from across the Fortune 500, and they graded those companies based on several categories relating to L, G, B, T, and Q, whether it was marriage equality, non-discrimination policies, health insurance, and other policies that created workplace equity and equality.
Do you want to take a pause?
Yeah.
Yep. Just like when there's like translators changing hands so they can catch up.
We're trying to be cognizant of our translating staff because we love them. Yeah. I focused on that, and I spent time, I failed, after I got trained, I failed in doing anything remotely useful at my company. So what I decided was, to heck with that, and I moved outside of that and became a trainer. So my job was to now go to Microsoft, T-Mobile, Costco, et cetera, and begin to train them.
Ask me a question about like fall 2012.
Fall of 2012. Well, actually, it was June of 2012.
Okay, I remember June.
Pride had just finished, and there was I think a gap. What was that gap for you like after the Seattle Pride Parade finished its route? And
before November?
Before November. We had the summer. What was that experience like for you, facing like, what do we do? How do we serve our community? How do we move our community forward?
Yeah, because that was the ramp up. The campaign was like really picking up steam. And I remember we were starting to organize. We were like the Witches of the Seven Hills. Wasn't that like our original
It was
cabal?
silly. Yes. We created a cabal called the Witches of the Seven Hills.
That's an inside joke, by the way. We're not actual witches. It was like we were making fun of the idea.
Yeah, and they destroyed the seventh hill. There's only really six hills.
6 hills in Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I remember we got together and we were talking about like, okay, TDOR is going to come up in November, which is Trans Day of Remembrance. Every year it happens to remember people who have been murdered or who have died in anti-trans hate crimes, or killed by intimate partners, or killed in unusual or unknown circumstances. And every year it's like the major event that happened for trans people. And I remember initially when we were talking, it's like to have a whole community whose highlight event of a year is centered around the death of people in a community it's a particular vibe. It like sends a very particular message about who is seen, what is like held up, and then also like it is covered by the press and cis people, and trans people become inherently associated with death, and not like just general death, talking violent death. And I remember we were like talking about like the meaning of that and how historically it has not been, there have been a lot of problematics about like who has produced TDORs, who are the survivors or victims that are talked about on TDOR, like that every year more people are dying, but there aren't policy changes that are trying to stop more people from dying. It's just like we're talking about the people who've been murdered. And I think there was like a sense amongst trans folks of like, we need more than support groups and TDOR.
We wanted to celebrate the living.
I remember that.
We wanted to honor and celebrate the living. Now,
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, do you remember like when the idea of Trans Pride came about? Because I don't actually.
it was somewhere in the September to October of 2012 range. We had recently convened somewhere in the neighborhood of 30, possibly 40 trans people that we knew, just friends, people that were like, cool, hey, I know you. And we wanted to solicit our community's experience and ideas for what would a trans-serving organization look like in Washington State, not just Seattle, not just King County, but all across the state. What would that look like? And TDOR came up, and we said, I think we very quickly were like, there are already organizations doing that. And I mean, as a white person, I also knew that my experiences moving about the world as a trans person, I was much less likely to experience the kinds of violence that a lot of brown and black trans people were experiencing at that time. So I think as part of our community-wide programming, and even as we developed our mission statement, we're like, we want to fight prejudice and we want to create community, but we don't specifically want to create our own Trans Day of Remembrance event. And there was very little trans content at any Pride event. And we had seen that for many, many years. Ingersoll would march in the parade and table, and that was about it. A couple of other local organizations that were Snohomish County, Pierce County, Whatcom, and that's it. Now, I think what's interesting is what was your experience with like developing a nonprofit? How did you want to organize? Because as our initial executive director, I think you came in with some ideas. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so I'd worked in queer nonprofits for about, like when we started, about 15 years. And like, I experienced homelessness when I was 15 and started working when I was 15 full-time in nonprofits. So like half-time legally, half-time under the table. And so I had seen a lot of nonprofits. I'd like been in a lot of different roles in nonprofits. And I remember just like being really afraid about how we would like manage the money, raise the funds, who would manage the like books and get all the legal paperwork. It's like a huge undertaking to become a 501c3, and how much that would take away from the actual doing the work. But I remember like when people really seemed to solidify around the idea of Trans Pride, I was like, oh, events, like event planning, I can totally do that. That's like, that feels really achievable. It felt like very discreet. It felt like this really cool kicking off point. And it's like, I don't want to start an organization from scratch without a built-in community and like without a base, without organizers, without like more attachment to like a bigger, broader network of folks. And I remember feeling like, yes, a huge event at Pride when people are paying attention, to mobilize people, to like get our message out, to get the attention of like the press, which we did. I remember that felt like that's how we're gonna launch a like advocacy and justice organization, is like start with what people love, which is a party. Remember I like would say this? I'm like, we have to do something that people love. Like give the people what they want. And who doesn't love a party? Like let's throw people this like huge bash, and then we'll canvas and like mobilize people, build an audience, and then that way when we try to go to the legislature, we actually have people that are like behind us. It's not just like 10 people talking for a community unelected, but there's like a base of people. And I think that was my vision of like the why and how, and I literally had no idea what we were taking on. And like 10 years in, I'm like, every year I'm like, why did we do this?
Yeah.
This is a terrible idea.
You ever bought something really big and you've never seen it before? You're like buying a cow out of a catalog. Just making that up. I don't know. But
I want fresh milk. I know. I'll buy a cow. I'll just put it in the backyard.
yeah, it'll be fine.
No.
I'm sure it'll be fine. So, Danni, do you remember what skills and experience event related that I brought to the table?
Tons. Yeah, like I think what I remember, so one of the things that I recall is like one of my anxieties is that for a lot of us, a lot of trans folks, we've been structurally shut out of jobs, right? Like unemployment is incredibly high. 1 in 4 trans people have experienced unemployment in the last year. 22 to 23% of trans folks have been homeless at some point in their life. There's like ongoing structural, not just like being shut out of jobs, but like being structurally denied access to like advancement or leadership or passed over. And that what that does, or what I had seen, and I'm sure what, you know, and my own experience, right, is like I knew my own limitations, even with like master's degrees, even with having worked in nonprofits, is like I'd never been allowed to manage the books of an organization. I'd never been put in a role where I could like talk to major donors because the organizations I worked in were ashamed of the fact that I was trans. They didn't want to put me in front of people with money.
Yeah.
And I remember that you brought like these incredible like film production skills and like you knew how to just like get shit done and like break it down from like the end product backwards. And then you also knew like, here's who we need to do this and this and this and this. And it was like our marriage was like, I knew all of the like how to hustle the nonprofits to get sponsorships, how to do the permitting. Do you know, like, do you know what I mean?
And I had 2012 was a busy year for me. I had worked on Hoarders, the TV show, and I was producing that. So I was coordinating remote shoots all across the country.
I remember this.
And that was a lot. And then I pivoted and started working on Top Chef 10. And I remember taking the call, show up tomorrow at 6 a.m. And I was like, okay, is it a paid gig? Yes. And I showed up and I was like, by the way, what is this? And they were like, it's Top Chef 10. And when the show wrapped, I got a lot of cool stuff from my kitchen. But I had so much producing experience, and I'm like, so we're just gonna do an event with no cameras. It's just people and things in a park with other people performing on a stage. I'm like, I can totally do that. And I think that bravado, that sense of confidence about like, yeah, let's do a show. And Danni applied for the neighborhood grant. And do you remember how much money started pouring in?
I do.
None.
Yeah. I remember that. I remember I had to like literally like beg. I wrote a like call sheet. I don't know if you remember this. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do call time. I like have worked in politics. I made a call sheet and it was like 630 people. I like dumped through my whole email, like, and I literally called every person and was like, I need $10. Like, just give me $10. Like, I will like mail you a handmade friendship bracelet. Like, I started to get like pretty desperate, but it was like people were not behind the idea the first year, and
They were very much not behind it.
It was like kind of messy, and like
Yeah.
what was so fascinating is everybody's like, oh well, can't you just go to, and then people would like name some, like, go to Microsoft, they'll give you money. I'm like, tell me who at Microsoft, what's their cell phone, like I will show up at their office. But
Bill?
that's just, yeah, exactly.
Hi, Bill.
Bill, hi.
Can you write me a check?
Mr.
Cool.
Nadella, it's Danni.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of people would like give me advice, and I'm like, I don't actually need advice. I just literally need your $10, which is really real for most small grassroots nonprofits. It's like, I appreciate the thoughts, but like, actually what we need is like either your sweat labor or like you calling 10 people that you know asking for $10. And that was like, it was terrifying.
Yeah. Now, what was that experience going to some of the city's LGBTQ elders, the people who had been here for many decades doing work and saying, hey, we want to put on Trans Pride? What were their responses to this idea?
She's shady. She knows this is like a call out. She's like, let me.
You don't have to name names.
Let me just like put this trap out for you. Just
All right.
walk on it. Just do it.
Let me set the stage. So the last time a large group of trans people had gotten together in mass was around the original Trans Day of Remembrance.
Yep, 98.
In 1998. And so the legend was that it had a couple hundred trans people all gathered in one space. And so we were thinking that's a high watermark for us. And how cool would it be if we were able to put on a thing where a couple hundred trans people would show up?
Yeah. I mean, Fred Swanson at Gay City was super supportive. I'd known Fred since I was a baby tran, and like Fred was amazing and became our fiscal sponsor. And Fred like would sit, it was like we had Dad Day on Friday. I like literally remember from like 3:30 until 5. And Fred would be like, I'm going to help you with your books. We're going to get out, like, we're going to do all the numbers. He's like, this week you need to raise $1,000. And it was like, I was so lucky to have had Fred. I still like, I get weepy thinking about it because he was like, took me under his wing. I do remember a lot of other people were super skeptical. They said, it's going to be a flop. You're setting yourself up for failure. You're taking on too much. There's no way that you're going to get people to turn out. It'll be like 150 people. You're going to spend thousands of dollars.
You should have a trans tent at a gay event.
And how many people showed up that first year?
That we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Okay, I'm sorry, but like I want to get to like the.
I know, we will. I promise. There's this moment. There is this one moment. I can't wait to share it with you. But you're gonna have to wait.
Oh, what else was happening for me in that spring?
You were not having a good time in life.
I wasn't.
No. How are you feeling? What had you learned about yourself?
Yeah, I had aplastic anemia. It's a bone marrow disease where my white blood cells were killing my bone marrow and I was dying. And I had a terminal diagnosis and I needed to find a bone marrow donor in order to have a bone marrow transplant. And I had a very poor bone marrow type. Like it turns out I know now that I have mixed ancestry, but it's like my bone marrow types, it's called HLA, is like very, very, I had like one type that was incredibly rare, and they were like, you literally have a 1 in 10 million shot of finding somebody.
She had these super, super rare, shiny Pokemon of bone marrow. It was awful.
B19-29A. Yeah. I still remember to this day, like, but trying to find people that like had the same Eastern Algonquin native ancestry and also other ancestry to like be a match. That was terrifying.
So to catch everyone up, it's November. We're not doing TDOR ourselves. We go to the other events. We promote it. We decide to do Trans Pride. It's January. We get a neighborhood grant. It's February. Now we're committed. And we're freaking out because we don't have any money and a neighborhood grant from the city.
We'd gotten the permit in February.
Yeah. But the city neighborhood grant says, spend the money, show us the receipts, and then we'll reimburse you. Really?
Yeah.
Thanks. You know, and that was very, very difficult. But we were also facing a budget shortfall because no money, you know, the money was not pouring in. How did we get performers?
Yeah, the performers were all people I knew. Ex-boyfriend, second best friend, other best friend.
Ian Harvey, if you've seen...
Why are you like throwing...
It's public record.
It's true.
Okay.
It is public record. So Ian came up and Ray came down from Canada.
Ray's a non-binary musician and performer from Canada.
Award-winning. Just put out a record, really amazing.
And then Julia Serrano, a Bay Area trans woman and author and I think professor.
Yeah, and then we had local performers. I don't even remember. I like feel bad, but like...
Now, raise your hand if you know Alexa Manila.
Yes.
Yeah.
Alexa Manila.
So Alexa, we actually got a lot of flack for having Alexa on our stage, even though from time immemorial, this professional drag queen was also a non-binary person and a professional in the community. And we had her as our first MC. And then we invited one person from every organization that we could find to come on our stage and go on for about 2 to 3 minutes and talk about what they were doing.
That's right. We had a lot of speakers the first year.
Yeah.
And that was like not super well received, but it was okay. And then we had the tabling fair.
Yeah.
And I remember that the tabling fair was like how we started to generate revenue to meet our match.
Yeah.
Because people, once we asked folks if they wanted to table, were willing to pay for their tent and stuff.
Yeah.
And
So
that's how we kind of like got the ball rolling.
remember, it's the first year. We're at Cal Anderson Park, which is, the Pike Pine corridor. It's Cal Anderson being one of the first openly and out gay legislators in the state. So it's a very centralized park. We're at one end of the meadow. It's this half circle meadow right there. And I'm pretty much tethered to the stage. I'm not moving. I'm not going anywhere. Danni was floating around, also on campus. But meanwhile, we had a march. Now, whose bright idea was it to have a march?
That was my idea.
That was your idea.
I'm so sorry.
I don't even remember who led the march.
I led the march.
So you were...
There are photos. There were photos of me leading the march. And
Okay.
I was wearing an incredibly inappropriate outfit, but it was fabulous.
Okay,
'Cause
imagine
I'm
this.
fairly certain that I had made it, but
Yeah.
I had a wardrobe malfunction about walking from when we had done setup, because that
Yeah.
first year we did a lot of the labor to set up, to the start of the march. And so there's all the photos are with the censorship bar,
Yeah.
because things were falling apart, and that
Yeah.
happens sometimes.
So if you can picture it, the plaza at Seattle Central Community College is a very big, open, wide plaza. The Dyke March will often launch themselves from that space. So we're like, let's do that too. That'd be great. And they marched south on Broadway before all the weird painted lines and the traffic and everything, and marched 2 blocks south to Pike, turn, and then turn on 11th and then cross, because we wanted to make a stink and inconvenience pedestrians and traffic alike. That's what a march should do. And then turn on 11th, walk down, cross Pine, and then turn into the east end of the meadow at the park. Now I'm at the west end, and I know it's 6 o'clock and things are happening, and I've gotten a call, the radio, and about 6:15 I start to see people pouring in at the far end of the meadow, and then I'm sitting on the stage and I turn my head south. And people were pouring in, and there's hundreds of people. Where are all these people coming from? This is amazing. Then I turned and looked, and there was still people marching. And I'm like, how many people is that? And I guess SPD has an algorithm. They're like, exactly how many people are standing in a certain space. They estimated 3,000 people showed up. Remember, 250 to 300 was the previous...
Our permit was 300. It was less than 500, so that we didn't have to pay.
Right.
And then it's 5,000 people showed up or something.
Yeah. I mean, the
They
first
still
year,
didn't make us
3,000,
pay, which was nice.
And then every year after that, we've seen 4, 5, 8, 10, 20,000 people. In 2019, we saw 25,000 people.
Yeah, it got huge.
Crammed into not just the meadow there, but also we had to expand the tabling fair. And, if you've ever been to a tabling fair, it's lots of organizations and sponsors. But we had 90 people.
Can I interrupt you?
You can interrupt me anytime.
We're doing the ASMR version.
The ASMR.
Just because I want to be thoughtful of time, I want to ask you some other
Sure.
sort of rapid questions,
Do it.
lightning round questions. Okay, favorites. So we've covered the first Trans Pride, which was just an immense, enormous the feeling that you had. Okay, so I have 2 questions. The feeling that you had at that first Trans Pride when you realized we got to the end and it was done and it was a success and it was blew me away success. What did it feel like? Because Viv asked me this and I was like, oh yeah, what did it feel like? What did it feel like when you realized that we did a thing and people showed up for it? And then what is your favorite memory from that first year that's really stands out? Because I know what mine was.
Okay. That experience at the end of the day when you're exhausted, you're putting things away, but you're like, we did that. Nobody's ever done that before. We did a brand new thing. We created something that didn't exist before. And the act of creation is powerful. And I felt that. And what a high. And every year when we're like, oh God, it's so hard. Are we going to do Trans Pride again? I remember how I felt. And I'm like, yeah, we're going to do that again.
Yeah.
And then the second part?
So what memory of that day really stands out to you?
That moment when all of the people who met the witches of the Seven Hills, those people. And then as we began to organize, and we were meeting, midweek for months and figuring out, what does this community want and how can we serve it? And then we all got together and went, oh my God, that's a year. We just put a year of our organizing on the books. And we all had that come together moment of, all the picture of all of us all gathered around together, exhausted and deliriously happy. And I'm like, this is what it means to create community. And that was a powerful moment for me.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I'll answer my own question. The moment I remember was going up on stage to accept the proclamation from the city. The city had given us a proclamation that declared it Trans Pride Day, which was a first. The council had passed it. The mayor signed it. That felt like a really big deal. It's the first time the city of Seattle had ever put trans anything onto anything that they then did a thing with, which felt big.
Yeah.
I remember getting on that stage, and the moment for me was every one of the organizers behind us, and looking out and just seeing all of the field full and being I knew this could happen. I knew that there were this many people. That felt amazing.
Yeah.
The feeling I had though at the end was I'm going to hospice in 2 weeks, and this is a good end cap to my life. And that is real. I say that because it's I'm healthy and good now, but I've struggled with 10 years of recurrent lymphoma. I've had lymphoma 3 times since then. And it's hard to explain to people the feeling of, we don't talk about death enough in our culture, and we don't talk about what the process of dying looks like. But I remember having such, I'm gonna get teary, having such peace of so much work and solitude up to that point, being a trans person in isolation in Southern Maine, or being here and not seeing trans people every day necessarily. And then to be with my family or my community for the first time is so powerful. It still overwhelms me to have felt mic drop, I'm out. It felt so good. And I just remember that that it was so clear how frail I was, because I look back at photos and I'm girl, you did not look good.
Yeah.
I looked so frail, but also the resulting just joy on my face. And it's I really look back at myself as a different person, and so grateful for so many people who came together. And I'm so grateful to you. I don't want to just mush out, but it's I just remember that pushed me. I really truly believe that I was able to make it to my bone marrow transplant and get through induction chemotherapy and make it through hospice because of the high. I was so high at that point that it's the crash. It's I think I made it through knowing that we were going to have that again the next year if I just held on through treatment.
Now, prior to this, I had been serving on the board of the Seattle Pride Parade. So I didn't actually execute any of that work. That was a huge other team, but I knew tons and tons of people. And from my work in the community, my workplace equality, me, rubbing elbows with tons and tons of people in the corporate world who were very supportive. And then seeing them all at Trans Pride. So Trans Pride wasn't just 3,000 trans people. It was everybody. Family, friends, coworkers. And
so many people.
So many people, yeah.
Okay, next question. How did we translate Pride? So we're a distinct organization, right? We do support for survivors of gender-based violence and hate crimes. We do legislative advocacy, lobbying, and public policy, media influencing. And then we have a Pride event, which is nowhere else is that the bakery mix of the nonprofit cake that everybody is be what? How do we transform that momentum into political power? Do you what are the? It's hard for me to really articulate it, but how do you think that? The Seattle Times, or how do you think that kind of we were able to take an event that's kind of everybody thinks of Pride as a celebration, and then manipulate that into effing stuff up by the time we got to the bathroom bills in 2016 and 17?
Yeah, I mean we all know what it's like to go to a fireworks show. and see the fireworks? How many people take pictures or video at fireworks displays? Come on, be honest. Raise your hand. You do that. How many people go back and go, why did I do that? You know, it's so much more powerful and visceral if you can just experience that in the moment. Be there. And you don't have to record it later. And I think we were able to, capitalize on the excitement of Trans Pride in that community, but then also navigate forward. Nobody had ever done anything like that. Seattle Times actually put us on the front page and put some pictures and
Above the fold.
Over the fold. And so I'm looking for the logo. We had our logo is a star, a mostly maroon star with a yellow-orange flame coming up as the top point. And the person who designed that logo is Gwen Ye, and her picture was above the fold on the front page of the Seattle Times that day. That was unprecedented and positive. I mean, today you can see lots of really negative related things in the media about trans people. In 2013, that was really powerful. And it wasn't just fluff. We weren't just a fireworks display. We're like, why are we having a Pride event? Why are we getting together? Why is coming together so important? And we were very articulate because we ought to support one another in this world of struggle where we don't have the same kinds of rights as everyone else. I'm just letting them catch up. You're good. Okay. So I'm going to change gears for you.
Sure.
What was your favorite performance over the last decade? The favorite moment at a Trans Pride?
That's really unfair. I feel like you're making me pick my favorite. It's like all my favorite people.
We only have
45
45 minutes, so
I know.
you can only pick one or three.
Can I give you categories?
You can give me a category, or you can have me go first to help.
I know what yours is.
Yeah, you
go
always
first.
know. Yeah. Okay. So Bambi Salcedo, who is currently the director of
Trans Latinas
Coalition, which is a national organization that works with people who are immigrants and also trans. She came to our stage, and at a time when trans women were being incarcerated as immigrants, and trans women were being incarcerated in men's prisons. She came to our stage, and she sat down, and her assistant began shaving off her head, or her hair. She had a full head of really blonde, gorgeous long hair, and it was so poignant to see her, and she was she could have been leading a march, and as powerful as she was, and having her hair shaved, and she's like, this is the experience of what it means to be a trans woman in an immigrant and detention facility. And I am shaving my head in solidarity with these people. And I was just I'm tearing up now, just thinking about how powerful that is. And now she rocks a short hair look. It's so gorgeous. But that really hit me as there's a struggle, and that is often just so invisible, and Trans Pride becomes one of those points of light for our community to be able to explain and explore what that means.
I think Andrea Jenkins, who is currently Minneapolis City Council president, being on our stage before she was elected, and Andrea's been a longtime friend and mentor, and did the trans history oral history project, and has just been has shaped and influenced so much of my thinking. And to have Andrea on stage, somebody that I'd known for a long time, and to hear her incredibly powerful poetry, and then that same year, to see her be the first trans person to get elected to a major office. I think people forget that it is not that long ago that trans women, a trans woman, let alone a black trans woman, get elected to public office. Andrea was the first, and I think that was the year after I had run for office for the 43rd district, so it must have been 2017. It was that for me was it all coming together of the power of her performance and her poetry, the like incredible history and legacy that she brings as an elder, the like political power that I know that we have like in our community. That was like for me just like incredible. I like don't, it's like I don't want to cry about it. I want to be like, it inspires me to just be like, knowing what Andrea has gone through in order to get to where she is. She's like the president, and I hope that she becomes like the mayor of Minneapolis and then like the senator. You know, like it's just like to know that and to be like that is in the world, and I live in the same time period as her is like that really blew me away about Trans Pride, that we could create a space that like people got to know her before she became famous, if that makes sense, but not really because she's like Minneapolis famous, but that felt so powerful for me. That's my favorite performance.
I love that. 0.3% of society openly identifies as trans. 0.3.
I think it's more than that.
Yeah,
I think it's closer to 1%.
Perhaps.
I'm just gonna say 1.
Point being, not very many.
Yeah.
And to know that somebody who is an out trans person is running for office and then succeeds, that's a big deal. This Friday we have Zoe Zephyr, who is a legislator from Montana who's famous for being kicked out of her legislative session. She'll be speaking on Friday, and we would love to have you come and listen to what that experience was like for her. But just to know that Trans Pride became not just a built stage, but an actual a world stage for so many really powerful moments in trans history.
What's been the hardest thing for you to pull off for Trans Pride? Like for you personally, what's like the hardest thing to do?
Sure. One of the hardest things to do is to ask people for money. Yeah.
That's not hard for me, but...
No, of course not. But
I'm so used to it now.
To be able to say, hey, can you donate $10 to Trans Pride?
The hardest?
And then just be quiet and wait for the other person to... I didn't
do it. I didn't let her wait.
There was an individual in the front row that was like, me? What? You know, and just being able to practice that and to say, hey, we would like you to sponsor Trans Pride and publicly do so, and we'd like that amount to be $10,000. And then just wait for them to go, and more companies are actually doing that with us. It's been really powerful. But getting over that hump, the first 3 years, it was terrifying. And I actually learned that skill. Great story. Danni was running for office. And
is that a great story?
It's great for me.
I'm glad.
Okay.
It was terrible for me.
Yes. But that moment, that night, so Fred, who was hosting the space and also a personal friend and a colleague and could afford it, was going to donate $500. And I didn't want to stand up in front of the audience and basically do the ask for the $1,000 ask. I didn't want to go, who wants to donate $1,000 to this person's campaign? And then crickets. So I was like, I need a shill. I need somebody in the audience who's just going to be my, I can do that. So I came to Fred and I said, Fred, will you do that? Will you do 1,000 instead of the 500? And he's like, yeah. And at the time I was like, cool, that's awesome. And then when I did my ask, I already knew I had at least one person. So I wasn't going to be standing there like an idiot. And I just said, listen, if nobody raises their hand, you raise your hand. But you're off the hook if at least one other person raises their hand. And he's like, fine, it's a deal. And I watched him, and it was like, who's going to do $1,000? And I watched his hand just slowly like, you know, and then 3 other people raised their hand, doom, doom, doom. And suddenly, you know, his hand was like, you know, and it felt so good. And it wasn't until later that I realized 2 things. 1, I'm actually really good at asking people for money. And 2, it was actually harder to ask Fred. I put my relationship with Fred at risk and saying, hey, I need you to double what you were planning on comfortably donating. And he did that for me. And suddenly now I can ask people for money, and it feels really good to be able to do so because they're donating to something really, really important. It's not just, you know, my second yacht.
Yeah.
I have 0 yachts, by the way.
I wish you had a yacht.
Yeah. How about you? What was your hardest thing about Trans Pride?
Being autistic, not knowing I was autistic, and people holding me to the standard of a neurotypical person every single year, every time. Every interaction, every expectation, every, like, if my communication is off 10%, if like I'm not like 100% on that day, if I've just like run out of spoons because my brain is like, no more words for today, having people hoist a particular narrative of what leadership looks like, having my disability be invisible, and having to either disclose my disability to people in order to get empathy from them so that they're not terrible to me, or conversely, having people treat me like my leadership is inadequate, or that I shouldn't be where I am, or that they could do it better when haven't seen anybody do it better yet. Like, there's kind of this like interesting, I think that has been a like complex challenge because it manifests in all of these very small interactions with strangers of just like working with hundreds of people for whom I may be the first autistic person that they've ever been subordinate or like had in a leadership position over them, and like having to grind that like experience and the tension there and just like live with it and process it. That has been excruciating, and it has meant that like when we get to the day of, I'm just like so out of spoons that I'm like, please let me vanish. I just wish I were invisible. Like
I call the day of the event the water slide.
Yeah.
And it's just the water's flowing, it's moving. We're on it. There's no going back, and there's no stopping. That's bad. And we're just gonna do it, however it is. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also been a joy. Yeah. It's also been like a joy to have the experience of like being in a position to have the opportunity to work with people, and like also know how many folks with disabilities run our the event is like run by all people with disabilities, it turns out, or it has like become that.
Our core values include accessibility and inclusion, and racial and economic justice, and sex positivity, and understanding that all of those different very human aspects of what it means to be both a trans, gender diverse, and also just a human being in society. Holding space for those values has been of vital importance to us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's been beautiful.
Yeah.
Audience questions? Yeah, let's do it.
It's time for that.
If you have a question, my lovely colleague Rachel has some note cards and pencils. And if you feel brave, I'm happy to run you the mic so you can ask the question yourself.
I'll ask you all a question while this is occurring. Raise your hand if you've been to Trans Pride before. All right, a few people. Raise your hand if you think maybe you're gonna come this Friday. Yeah, even a few more.
Which reminds me, hold on, I have to hit the next slide. That Trans Pride is looking for volunteers still. So if you'd like to scan this QR code to volunteer for one of the following duties, please do so. There's also a QR code in the back.
Our event is at Volunteer Park, so it's perfect for volunteers. That's not why it's called that. But we're at Volunteer Park on a brand new city-built stage.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Our tabling fair has somewhere in the 60 to 70 different organizations ready to tell you how awesome we are.
And it's grown so much. Like,
it's huge.
Massive by comparison. I think we had 23. I looked at the spreadsheet from 13. Yeah. We had 23 organizations, and I remember thinking how implausible it was that we would fit them all, and now we have like 70. It's incredible.
Can you ask me a question with the word corporate in it?
Oh, about our corporate sponsorship policy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, other people must have questions. I want to hear their questions.
That's fair.
People can read about it.
I will say, do one of you want to ask us about a corporate policy? I guess the whole Q&A thing, that's what it is.
Yeah. Don't let her rope you in.
We got a question here.
Sure. Okay.
What is one policy you think is needed for trans people in Washington and the U.S. nationally?
That's a really good question. Since I'm the policy wog, do you mind if I take that?
Do it.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different policies. I think that obviously, like, I'm a really big fan of like the Equal Rights Amendment, but making the ERA be something that is a little bit more inclusive. But I do think that having a constitutional amendment is like long past time to have a constitutional amendment that guarantees bodily autonomy and equality between all sexes and genders. And that for me is like the thing that feels like there needs to be momentum. We're in a really serious backlash. It feels deep and it feels protracted and it feels like there has been an ongoing long-term psychological warfare against trans people. Like that feels like we are deep inside of it. But I can kind of feel the like plane pulling up a little bit. And I think that like as the momentum builds, I would love to see a new push for a new Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So let's be all sunny and optimistic. You said you feel the plane pulling up a little bit. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I guess part of this is like decades of like working in politics, and we go through these like cycles where you have like hysteria and like just like way over the top fervent moral panic, and it kind of like starts to like jump the shark a little bit. And I think that like the Republicans were 1 year too soon, in the sense that we now have had several federal judges, including Trump appointees, say like bans on trans health care are clearly unconstitutional. Every single bill that has been passed has been enjoined. As soon as lawyers get into court, they're enjoined. And I think what is gonna happen is like people are gonna look around and be like, actually, like, does it make sense that we're like legislating, like in West Virginia, for instance, their sports ban affected one trans girl. They spent 830 hours in the legislature of West Virginia debating a bill that affected one person, a 13-year-old girl who was the last in her cross-country team, by the way. She's a terrible cross-country runner, but bless her heart, you know, like, but 800 hours of legislative time in West Virginia, I think people are gonna be like, is that why we're paying you to like be in your legislature to like debate this one person running cross-country? Like, it's a little ridiculous. So I feel like we are kind of, I know it's like in our darkest moments, it's like, I feel like we were here in 2004 during Bush's re-election when Richard Mailman, who was the head of the RNC and also a closeted gay man, pushed constitutional amendments in 32 states to ban same-sex marriage. And it's hard to remember that it was 11 years between 32 states amending their state constitution. That's not even just like legislation, that's a constitutional ban. 11 years between that and Obergefell. And that's not to say that trans people are on that same trajectory or that that trajectory is guaranteed, but they're like the seeds of their own destruction have been planted, and it's just gotten so obscene. And the reality is like, I know trans people, I've known them my whole life, I am a trans person, I was a trans youth, I know tons of trans youth, I've worked with literally thousands of them as a therapist, as an activist, as a summer camp counselor, and I'm just like, they're wonderful people. And the reality is like, if you get to know trans people, they're just people, messy, girl, but wonderful and like beautiful humans. And I think that that reality will always prevail despite all of the hyperbole and all of that. So I feel it in my bones, and it's hard. Over the spring, as like the legislative session happened, in Twitter in particular, and trans Twitter, there was a lot of panic. And for me, it's like the thing I fear the most is despair. I feel like the reason why we do Trans Pride is because despair is a disease of fear and loneliness, and despair leads to suicide. And what trans people don't need is to feel despair. And that is what a lot of these bills are. They're psychological warfare against a community. They're gonna be found unconstitutional, but what they can do, the very real harm, is they can cause people to feel despair, and that despair poisons us and causes us to harm ourselves. And so I'm all about the upshot. Like, I'm all about the like, we are gonna pull out of this stronger. And I'm like looking forward to the next 20 years because I only see upward trajectory for trans people. Like,
Yeah.
You can try, but like we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, you can't ban people out of existence. It's not gonna happen. So
Exactly.
I feel positive.
I'm often motivated by a phrase. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, and then you win. And I'm like, yeah. Like, and I'm always wondering which phase we're in.
Definitely the
And
fight.
it's certainly feeling the fight right now. I'm encouraged by just the resolve of so many people who've said, you know what, I'm going to break all stereotypes and norms of what it means to be a human in this world and be myself. And we're doing that not just in our own lives, but also in our communities. And we're saying, you know, we're going to succeed.
And authenticity is infectious.
Yeah.
Truly. I think that it's like people see that, and it's easy to hate the unknown and people you don't know. And the biggest challenge, we've known this for a long time, the biggest challenge is like if you ask Americans, do you have a close friend, family, or coworker that is gay? 82% of Americans do. If you ask them, do you have a close friend, family member, or coworker that is trans? Only about 14%, 25% if you extend that to like acquaintances. So only 1 in 4 Americans know a trans person, and that is our biggest challenge. And it will continue to be because our population is small, but inevitably, I think we're gonna win.
Yeah.
I know we are. And I'm 40, I've got like another 45 years to keep winning, so I plan to.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So I'm from Europe, and I had to see the pressure there too. And we have the pressure from what we know with people who have leave Russia since 2014.
Yep.
And now we see the situation here in the United States that people must leave their states.
Yep.
It's for Florida and Texas and some other states. How do you think how many people must leave their states? So it's affected Russia, and I think some thousands, but I think here in US we have many higher numbers.
Yeah, I mean, if you Google my name, you can read all about me. And like, as you might know, I had to seek asylum in Sweden in 2018. And that was like a whole complicated and terrifying and difficult period in my life. And the threat to trans people's lives is very real. And I, as somebody who had to seek asylum in another country, I know that it is never an easy decision for people to leave their home and their families and their community and make a decision that like my safety is more important right now. And I think that there will be a lot of refugees, internally displaced persons. We don't talk, like, the US is really fascinating. If you go to Europe, or if you go to like Southeast Asia, or if you go to Middle East, like there's a whole, even like South America, there's like a whole global language of how we talk about these things that gets applied outside of the United States, but we never say internally displaced people inside the United States. We don't talk about that like political attacks in some states are intending to displace people, like to push them away. Even though we've signed conventions that say our government will protect internally displaced people, will provide them with financial support. If you're internally displaced because your healthcare is made illegal, for instance, that you have the right to have a government that will protect your rights and provide you with remuneration or protection. Anybody who, like, I sought asylum in Sweden, I had very good and specific reasons at that moment in time, and that time has passed. But what Sweden would say and what every other country would say is the United States is a developed democracy with a constitution and courts that work, and your rights should be protected by your courts, and so you cannot have asylum in this country. And so we're going to send you back. And the US does that too. If you came from Europe to the US, if you came from like Japan, for instance, to the US, we would say, no, you can't have asylum, you have to go back. And so it's very fascinating for people who haven't looked deep into the system of seeking asylum or what asylum means. It's really important to understand what internal displacement means, how these laws came into being, what they actually do, what they're intended to do, and what they don't do. And so I worry a lot about it. I worry about who cannot flee those states, like who can't leave Florida or Texas, who is stuck there, and then what does it do to the political power of the community in those states when a lot of people leave?
Yeah.
Because that can also really change the dynamic of power. It's been a conversation we've been having nationally amongst trans activists of like, how do we support people both on the ground and then people who feel they need to leave?
Yeah.
And how do we not tilt the balance to take away the political power in the places where we need to fight so that they don't become sort of like forever anti-trans, you know, and become calcified in having these laws that don't allow trans people to survive there.
Yeah.
Because there will always be trans people coming out. There will always be new trans people emerging from those states where I think Texas has like 24 million people, like so many trans people.
Yeah.
So I worry and think about it a lot. And I wish we had the political power to do more. Just also recognize our community's serious numerical and financial limitations.
The state with the largest concentration of trans people, California, and the second largest is Florida.
Yep.
So estimates of 100,000 people. And there are definitely situations and scenarios where people are like, for the safety of my family, we're going to move. But there are some people that are like, I can't move. But then there are also people like going into an ice cream store, an ice cream shop, and there's only one flavor. I'd like vanilla, please. And they're just like, it's not great, but I'm choosing to stay here and I'm choosing to fight. And that gives me a lot of hope. And I will admit, I drank some of that headless chicken sauce, as I call it. You know, that little bit of a panic. I'm like, I could never go to Florida. But that's not true. It's not great, but it doesn't mean it's completely off limits for me. It just means that the challenge is greater for some people that they're experiencing that. But it actually gives me a lot of hope. And as Danny's talked about, those enjoined bills, they're like white papers that are being peer reviewed and dumped on the ground. Their peers, not their peers, but the judges are like, yeah, none of this makes any sense. Any person can understand that these bills don't make sense on their face, and so we're not going to allow that. And that gives me great hope.
And it's easy. I think the other dynamic that happens in political discourse, this is getting autistic and nuanced, but it's easy to say there are good places and bad places, but if you talk to a trans person who's survived hate crimes in Seattle, or who's been shot at by Nazis in Seattle, or who's been assaulted by cops in Seattle, like, this isn't always a safe place. Like, it's easy for us to make a narrative of like passing a law makes a place unsafe, and it does, truly. But just because a law says good things about a population doesn't mean that every person is going to be physically safe in that place. And I think shifting my thinking to remind myself that like not every place is safe for all people all the time, and to not always, and this is in conversation with a lot of people in Florida, in Texas, in Arkansas, supporting their activism, and remind myself that like almost no trans people are safe no matter where they are, like truly, truly safe, and that there is danger everywhere. And that danger just looks different, whether it's state-sanctioned violence or whether it's interpersonal violence, and those can shift. So I think that that's the other thing I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's very nuanced, but also very real.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got an audience question here. There's a lot of educators in the room from UW College of Education, right?
Yeah.
Yay.
That's awesome.
So the question is, what is the state of trans support in schools for students and for teachers? Not just Seattle public schools, but the Puget Sound area.
That's challenging. I mean, even in what might be considered a blue state or a liberal or like whatever you want to call Washington State, it's really more purple. And so there's always going to be a need to be watchful. And there are groups with, you know, words like liberty and freedom in their names that are, you know, so concerned about the kids that they're going to, you know, run for office and try to get onto different school boards. And there's a level of vigilance that is necessary to ensure that we all are able to preserve our freedoms and our liberties. So we can use those words too. So I mean, that's my take, is that everything is always under threat forever, and everything isn't terrible. So I think both of those statements are true, and it's a both-and situation.
I think one of the most interesting things that I learned when I worked at GSA Network, which supports GSAs in about like 3,000 high schools around the US, was that curriculum inclusion is the greatest indicator of LGBTQ young people's sense of safety and their positive experience in school. And I know that like in California, we passed the Fair Education Act, and I don't remember exactly what it stands for. It's been, I think it was like 2010 or something, but it mandated curriculum inclusion in California, and in California purchased textbooks, which consequently meant a lot of other states got curriculum inclusion because they purchased the same textbooks as California, which was positive. But we don't have a law in Washington state yet. It's something that, like, we don't work specifically on trans youth issues in terms of policy, and since we're not leading that, I haven't really pushed it. But I know for folks who are working in schools, for educators, curriculum inclusion across the board, and it does not matter, like Stephen Russell at University of Arizona is a researcher specifically looking at like for students of color, indigenous and native students, for like AAPI students, that like across the board, curriculum inclusion is like the greatest indicator of like students' overall success, their sense of community, their sense of like feeling safer in their school. And I always found that like really fascinating, that like even with like safe schools policies or GSA clubs or anti-bullying trainings, like it really did not matter. He looked at like 20 different interventions, and they're all like pale in comparison to having comprehensive curriculum inclusion. And so I'll just leave the educators in the room with that. Like, and that is really fascinating as somebody who went through school. Like, I don't ever remember anybody openly talking about LGBT people like K through 12, like not once. Yeah. And so I think that I'll leave you with that. Stephen Russell, University of Arizona, he's published a lot of books. I've worked with him as a researcher. He's amazing. He has a lot of really incredible papers, and he's a researcher in education. But that is like incredible. Like, he's done the work, and it's really, really powerful work.
Hi, I'm hoping to attend on Friday, so thank you.
Yay, we hope you do.
I attended a recent industry event that was promoted as LGBTQIA, and was really disappointed at how cis-normative it was. And I understand that there's a long history of intentionally broader queer spaces not being very welcoming to trans people and gender diverse people. How can they do better?
That's a very good question. Centering the experiences of the most marginalized, and I'll narrate what I'm going to do with my hands. I'm going to put my arms out really wide, like I'm going to give 8 people a hug all at once. Now, if you understand a bell curve, you've got all that area close to your y-axis, and that's where all the attention is. Now, the trans people, we're out here on the fringes. We're about 1% of society. And I just do this when I'm doing my trainings and my public speaking. And I just say, being able to open your arms wide enough to meet and see the most marginalized in our communities, you still have all of that space in the middle, that, you know, the big part of the bell curve. They're still covered. But when you are centering, or when you are working and putting in the labor to include the most marginalized people in our communities, the people where there are intersectional identities that people are experiencing, what does it mean to just be trans? Well, that's a great story. But sitting in front of you are 2 white passing people. We're not hearing the stories of Black trans women. We're not hearing the stories of people with disability, like physical disabilities. Danny's talked a lot about some of the invisible disabilities that she's experienced. So being able to like really dive deep and figure out what are those intersections and how can we center those experiences, because people want to be able to see themselves on that stage.
I think it also takes relationships and mass. So like the 2 important things are like, I think I didn't realize that this was like my own functional limitations as a person with autism, but like I have a really hard time imagining multiple relationships at the same time. And so I see the world through a series of individual relationships that are not necessarily interconnected, which neurotypical people may see groups as being a bunch of interconnected relationships, but I see them as a like spoke and wheel, because that's how I have to manage relationships. It's like one-on-one, one at a time. That feels manageable to me because I'm constantly masking to like be able to reflect. And so the things that I've noticed for myself is that like having a mass of people, being really intentional about who I'm building a relationship with, and then like if I were to say try to create a nucleus or like a kernel of people, I would be like, I'm not going to just invite one trans person to join that meeting of like mostly cis like LG folks. I'm going to invite like 3 or 4 trans people, so there's like a mass, and I'm going to make sure that I have a relationship with each of them, so that then there's like a collective, and then that in turn shifts the dynamic in the room where those people don't feel like tokenized, they don't feel isolated, and they also like, it's interesting, like you'll suddenly start to see that like other trans people will start to appear, because I've been in many cis gay and lesbian groups where it's like I'm the only one, and then I'll like drag somebody else with me, Elayne or like Ganesha or like some of my other friends, and there's like 3 of us, and then suddenly there's like somebody else will be like, oh, I convinced my trans friend to come and meet you at this cis gay and lesbian space, and then there's like 5, 7, 9 trans people in that space. So that's kind of been like my more like structural advice, is like intentional deep relationships, but also you have to have a nucleus that is multiple people, because if I walk into a space that's all cis gay and lesbian folks, especially if it's all like cis gay and lesbian white folks, I'm going to go in that space once and be like, I'm not here, this is super awkward, ugh, like love you all, like I'll check you out in a little bit. Like that's going to just be how I flow. Our culture is deeply segregated, and there are reasons both pro and con for why that exists, safety, emotional safety. But I think trying to be more intentional and to like build those individual relationships first, I think is the like organizing method that has worked for me to transform some of those spaces. And also accepting that like some spaces are just never gonna get there. And like, I don't wanna like traumatize trans people by bringing them to a space where it's gonna be a hot mess and be like, ooh, like trans people do not need to be in spaces that are gonna be messy all the time. Yeah. I've also just become okay with like not being in places that don't want me.
Yeah.
And like, not every place has to like, I don't wanna go.
Circling back to schools, if you could partner with public schools, what would you like that to look and sound like? Though you don't do, youth programming first.
I mean, I guess do you mind if I talk about GSA
Do it.
Network?
Yeah, it's a
I mean, I
great
think like, so GSA Network was like really transformative for me, and like Alliance for Educational Justice, which is focused on like ending the school to prison pipeline. There's a huge intersection there. I feel like the schools that we had the best relationship to really worked hard to think about their approach to education in a holistic sense. And what I mean by that is the schools that really stood out to me, like LA Unified School District, there were some like really amazing schools in LA Unified School District that like worked really hard to have a like year-long, well thought out schedule of programming for queer and trans youth of color that involved a blend of like community mentorship, after school activities, like a GSA club that was peer run, curriculum inclusion, and then like field trips and culturally relevant events that allowed young people to feel more connected to their school, like bringing them to the LA LGBTQ History Museum, for instance, but like dragging all of the students there. I saw some schools that was like the type of engagement that I was like, this is amazing. Like for a public school that has a pretty like high queer and trans youth of color population, this like very thought out, very like, quarter by quarter, these are the 5 activities we're gonna do as a full school. That was amazing. It's also a lot of work, and we're like tiny. We have 3.5 full-time staff now. We've been as large as 5 staff, but like trans organizations are never going to be more than 5 to 7 staff because our community can't support that kind of staffing. And so it's difficult for us we have to be like really targeted at like, and methodical and strategic about like what tactics and approaches have the most impact and what folks need us and want us to do. And I hate that that's the reality of our work.
follow-up question.
Sure.
Can you tell the audience why you created the University of Washington Trans Health elective?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we teach a class at the University of Washington School of Medicine. I think this is our ninth year. It's one of the only medical school electives in the U.S. It's one of only 5, and that's because it just literally didn't exist. There was literally no medical schools teaching trans medicine.
2 hours is what most people going through medical school reported as the maximum amount of education about trans people that they'd gotten in their career.
Yep.
Lots of letters after their name, and only 2 hours of that was about trans people. So,
And it's literally just like trans people exist and they have a mental illness. Like, to be clear, they're like in the DSM, gender dysphoria, here it is. Now let's talk about it for 2 hours. It's not like, here's how to prescribe like gender-affirming hormone treatment, or like here's like the options for gender-affirming healthcare. It has been wild. I think I've trained over 1,000 doctors now. We do a pre-test and a post-test before like the start of the 10 weeks, at the end of the 10 weeks, and it's just like literally the same test. And like every year, it's just like my brain melts on the first night of class when I like look through that test. I'm like, this is, and it's not their fault, right? Like we live in a society that just gatekeeps that education, but it's been really hard at times.
And it's a significant percentage of trans people out in the world talk to their well-meaning medical providers and educate their own doctors on how to treat them. And it's like, wow, what is that like? So I think this UW course is actually a really powerful moment for education. I hope a lot of other universities choose to do that.
That's what I love about the right wing in this moment, is they're like, trans kids are getting the care, their sex changes at 10. And I'm like, where? Where? Who?
Do you know how hard it is to get care?
Like,
It's
just, it's so like it's like deeply ironic if you've spent 25 years building that, like literally building it from the ground up. And I'm like, that is not real. Like, it's literally taken us 25 years in one of the most progressive cities to get a surgeon at Harborview. Like 25 years of just like consistent, nonstop, like yelling at people, like every person that will listen. Like 25 years to get Seattle Children's to have a trans youth clinic, and they like are super conservative. It's like 2 years of therapy before you're getting like puberty blockers for the most part. I mean, and before we had that, they wouldn't even let us refer, like I was a per diem therapist, they wouldn't even let us refer our patients who we'd seen for years to primary care providers. If you were a therapist, they're like, can't do it. You can talk to them all you want, but don't ever give them a primary care provider's information. Like, that was here in Seattle until 2012. Like, people, it's just wild. The world is wild, and I wish whatever the fantasy is that Republicans are having, I wish that world were true. I'm fine with it. I wish I had the power to trans people with a magic wand. Like, come forth, my younglings.
Yeah.
You all should see my DMs. They're wild. The things people think I can do, it's just beyond.
Cool, I think we have one last.
Sorry.
You can do it. We believe in you.
I was just wondering, what is the reasoning behind you, like, up until 2012, not being able to, send patients to primary care?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Tradition?
I mean, we could talk after. Yeah. I mean, there's, everything that is happening now, all of the narratives of like grooming and all of these accusations that have come forth of like all trans, like I'm publicly, like if you Google my name, you'll see, I like have been publicly open about being a childhood sexual abuse survivor. I helped to take out like a mayor of Seattle, like risk my whole political career, my like organization's reputation. Like I've spent more time and energy, changed the law so the statute of limitations was lifted. So you can, if you were a child sexual abuse survivor in Washington State, you can forever sue whoever abused you, right? Like I've put in the work to do that work. Few people are like, trans women are leading that fight, but like politically, I have burned the house down for young people.
Yeah.
But that accusation carries so much weight in institutions run by straight white men who are terrified of trans people, despite the statistics, and we know who are the perpetuators of most childhood sexual abuse in this country and what institutions perpetuate that. there's a lot of, and has historically, it's why I don't do therapy, it's why I became completely an activist and gave up my medical career, because I could not work in any institution without literally having like a co-therapist
Yeah.
to sit in every single therapy session with young people. I'm not fucking kidding you, up until like 2014.
Yeah.
Like if you can imagine like being a 10-year licensed therapist and like not being trusted to be alone with a young person is like wild. But like that is the reality of what it means to be a trans person. And I was just like done with it. I'm like, okay, like
Yeah.
it's just wild. And I think that's kind of perpetuates in a lot of places. Like certainly if I left Washington State, that would be the case in Idaho, for instance.
And as the parent of a 17-year-old boy, a cisgender boy, I will tell you, he resists all kinds of grooming, including self-grooming. But he resists.
It's a bad joke, Elayne.
It's a terrible joke. But I mean, like
Tasteless.
as a parent of a young person, am I the engineer designing this human to do exactly what I want them to do? Or am I a guardian? Am I a support for that person? And I'm steering them through their life as they're discovering who they are, and they just need some guidance and support. And I love watching him do whatever he's going to do in the world. And I also love sometimes being disappointed. I'm like, I would never have done that. And that seems like a terrible idea. But go you know? And
Favorite therapist moments.
Yeah.
That's a bold choice.
That's a bold
very
choice.
Interesting choice.
Yeah. But, I think if we're able to support our youth and believe them and listen to them and not treat them like objects or property, but tiny humans that need our guidance and our love.
And support.
And
yeah.
support. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really upsetting that was the case. I'm glad that they have a program now, but there aren't trans people that are running it. It's like, and ...
Yeah.
It's like that is... and will forever be, the reality, I think, for a lot of trans people is like that.
Yeah.
And it's a question I often ask myself, like,
Yeah. We're getting the look.
yeah, let's do it. Let's wrap up. I'm done.
I know that I want to respect y'all's time.
Yep.
Since it's 8, so.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right. Thank
Thank you
you
so much, Laura.
Thank you both so much. Please give Danni and Elayne a big round of applause. All right. And this will remain up, so please do sign up to volunteer. And we'll be back in September for History Cafe, building more inclusive community collections.
It's great.
I know I put you on the spot.